Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have with us Dr. Andrew Polk, Associate Professor of History at Middle Tennessee State University and the author of the critically acclaimed book, Faith and Freedom, Propaganda, Presidential Politics, and the Making of an American Religion. We also have with us Ms. Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who is the editor of Liberty Magazine. And we also have with us Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the General Counsel and Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Great to have you guys here with us and looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, one of the struggles that we're starting to see with religious faith in a contemporary Western society is that they're struggling with the idea that religious beliefs claim that they all have the truth. And the concept of you having the truth is really very unpopular from a position standpoint in Western society. All religions believe that they are exactly where they're supposed to be, but then there's always a certain amount of moral inconsistencies that exist in all religions. You know, all religions want their own identity. All religions have this point of view that they will always focus on. But in Western society, it seems as though if you are not in favor of the religion as I see it, then you must be somebody who's out of step with society. But a lot of Western culture is coming back to say, well, if all of you think you have the truth, maybe being out of step means I actually have the truth. You know, Bettina, one of the things I've always had a struggle with is when you go to church and you go someplace and they say that my message from this particular denomination is the truth. And then you have another group that believes the same thing. Well, if you're not part of either one of these groups, then you're asking yourself, well, wait a second, if they got the truth, then what do I have? And if their truth seems to be conflicting, maybe I actually have the truth. And Western society seems to be pushing back on this concept.
You're absolutely right, Orland, that Western society is going in a different direction. But really the question of strong belief, of people believing or denominations believing they've had the truth, they have the truth. I mean, this is just, you know, a fact of humanity for since time began. But we are now living, I guess, in the aftermath of really the new atheism movement, which was about 15 years ago. So you have commentators like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins. They're all making this argument for why organized religion is just not rational. It's incompatible with modernity. You know, they're comparing belief in the Bible with belief in a flying spaghetti monster. I mean, that's the culture that we're increasingly living in today. And I think that's reflected in religious demographics because, you know, 1999, we have 70% of Americans are reporting that they belong to a religious organization. They're active in their faith. Last year, that figure was just 47%. So, you know, the problem that you're describing is significant. And it's significant also for issues of religious freedom because, you know, how do you make the case that religion should be treated specially in society, get special legal protection if people increasingly believe that religion is irrational and divisive in society?
You know, Arlen, I think I'm going to disagree a little bit as far as where Western society is as far as its understanding of truth, because my experience has been that we're now at a place where everyone is saying that their own individual truth is something that's valid, right? Yeah. It's something that, and they're looking for protections for that. And again, I think that's where we see growing challenges because if each individual has their own truth respected, whether it's legally or, you know, socially or things like that, first of all, it diminishes what truth is, right? From societal perspective, but then also from a legal component, where do we go from there? I think Bettina made a really good point as far as the lack of personal identity that's fallen as far as individuals having faith as part of their identity is really a part of the differences that we're seeing, or the differing perspective. And I think also probably a misuse of believers in asserting their truth on others, right? I think we're seeing, in the past, particularly here in the United States, there was a real respect for religious freedom, for really being very proud of the religious diversity here in the United States. And now we're sort of moving to this perspective of there is only one true religion, right? There's only one sort of true religious perspective, and that needs to be something that everyone embraces. There is no space for a diversity of perspectives just even in the spiritual realm.
Andrew, you've actually written a book in which part of the title talks about the making of a religion. It almost sounds as though what Melissa is describing, that everyone's truths they believe should be the foundation of almost their religious beliefs. And it seems as though everyone's making their own kind of religion that they'd like to abide by.
Yeah, and this isn't new in American history, right? My favorite is, have y'all heard the term the burned over district? It's usually connected with Joseph Smith and Mormonism, where he was from in upstate New York. It was called the Burned Over District in the early 19th century because the Methodists would come through and have a week-long revival, and the Holy Spirit would send its fire through. And then the Baptists, and then the Presbyterians, and it got to the Spirit swept through, it burned everything down, right? We literally called it the Burned Over District. But the way that has historically worked in the American tradition, is what we call the religious marketplace. If I think you're wrong, I and the other people, my family, the ones who believe what I believe, will generally go across the street and form another congregation of the exact same thing, right? The difference that's happened in the 21st century is a whole lot of people are just giving up religion itself, or at least institutional religion, right? The largest growing group and the second largest, quote unquote, religious group in America are called the unaffiliated, or the nuns. And right now it's roughly 27% of the population. Some of those, a small percentage, are atheists or agnostics, but the majority are, quote unquote, spiritual but not religious. They have spiritual beliefs. Sometimes this is a combination of a lot of different religious traditions. But in the end, they say, I just don't want to be affiliated with that stuff, right? With the institution, with the organization, but I am something else. I don't think that personally is necessarily a bad thing. And I think it's good when we get, in some sense, institutions historically have dominated and told you what you can and can't believe, or you're an other. I think we have kept that same tendency in America. We know who the good guys and the bad guys are, right? Who the others are, who the ones that are coming. But we've become so fragmented, the vast majority of everyone we'll ever meet in our lives are somehow other, right? And so that conflict becomes really hard to manage on a societal level.
Andrew, you mentioned the unaffiliated, and it was interesting. I found a statistic saying that of those that end up becoming unaffiliated, the vast majority leave because they no longer believe in the faith, the religious teachings of their particular faith tradition, right? It's 67% of those that end up leaving and becoming unaffiliated. And I think you're right. In the past, people might just go across the street to find a church or a faith tradition that aligns with their beliefs. And nowadays people are just saying, I'm just going to be spiritual, and that's enough, because people are like, if any beliefs don't align with mine, then I don't want to be part of this anymore.
But you know what the struggle is, Bettina, when I take a look at this? If I have the truth, there's an assumption that what you have that's different from me is not the truth. And in a society, in particular in American society, where it's about winners and losers, I always believe that the best way to figure out who the winners are is to point out who the losers are. So if I've got the truth, that means I'm the winner. If you don't have the truth, no matter what it is, it sounds like you're the loser in this. So it almost sounds like what society is saying is, I don't want to be labeled as the loser from a religious standpoint. Yeah,
you're describing a pretty dysfunctional dynamic there. had a really interesting conversation just a few weeks ago with New York Times columnist Ross Douthat. I interviewed him for Liberty magazine, and he's just written a new book called Belief. And it's really just about, why belief in God is rational and why it's something that people should consider. It's a fascinating book, and his ideas, Orlin, are almost the exact opposite of what you just presented. His ideas of belief are that it is actually something that is growing less, it is growing more viable in today's society, and that people are starting to realize that it's not religion that is playing this divisive, polarizing role per se. It's more that it's about humans being human. And even if you took religion out of the equation, you would still find the division, the dysfunction, and the hostility and violence that we see within today's political discourse. So Orlin, I don't know. My personal feeling is that he's correct, that humans are going to be human whether religion is part of the equation or not.
Orlin, the work that we do on Capitol Hill on behalf of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we often partners with other faith traditions, many of them very different in their either understanding of the Holy Bible or perhaps used, entirely different holy text, right, as far as the basis of their religion. And I think something that I appreciate about the Seventh-day Adventist Church's position in partnering with other faith traditions and its understanding of religious freedom is that we believe in the right to be wrong. I think is one of the ways that we often say it. We, in fact, don't believe in it. We stand up for that because we believe that we have a God who stands up for that, right? Who allows us to either choose his truth or not, right? We may believe in our own truth. We may believe in the truth of our own faith tradition, but allowing that grace and dignity for individuals to be wrong in our eyes.
And I think that's a great point in how we address what we believe with others. Jennifer, I had somebody say to me one day, I was having a conversation and I used the term non-Adventist. And they said to me, that sounds very exclusive, Orlin. That sounds like the idea that if I am not what you are, that there's something wrong with me. And now I've had to change my thought process where I don't use non-Adventist anymore. I call you pre-Adventist. And that's the way, hopefully, I can try to figure out a better way to talk with people. But I think how we speak to people is a big part of it, Jennifer.
No, I agree. And I think we have to be mindful of the words that we use. And make sure that they're not exclusionary words, right? And that we are open to letting people have their own beliefs, even if they don't align with ours, to be respectful of people's right to believe what they want to believe.
And I believe that at the end of the day, if we find ourselves expressing our viewpoints in a civil manner, that in and of itself will be the most important thing that probably Christ or your God would want for you to do, and hopefully our society will push more in that direction. There's a case in Tennessee that's called the United States versus Skrmetti, in which really you find the case where you have the American Civil Liberties Union working in conjunction with a local major law firm, Aiken Gump, and they're suing the state of Tennessee to block the state's ban on medically necessary gender-affirming care for Tennessee's transgender youth. Legal advocates are suing Tennessee on behalf of Samantha and Brian Williams of Nashville and their 15-year-old transgender daughter. Two other plaintiff families have filed anonymously, but what we see here is there was a doctor by the name of Susan Lacey. In addition to wanting to make sure that she's obviously practicing the way she sees fit, some have come to the conclusion that she failed to engage in what was called emergency medical surgery or emergency medical procedures. And the law that exists right now kind of establishes a private right of action against medical providers that are providing medically necessary care to trans youth. Jennifer, when they start taking a look at what's going on here in terms of something that is quote unquote, medically necessary, or what is deemed to be elective in certain viewpoints, it starts to get very confusing as to where a state can go, where they can draw the line. And when you draw the line where part of your society is uncomfortable, it seems like we got advocates, we've got attorneys, we've got law firms, we've got, legislative bodies that are deciding, well, we got to jump in and make the call. I can't figure out who should be involved in this, Jennifer, and who shouldn't be involved in this.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason is because this is such a complex issue with so many different parties involved, right? We're talking about medical treatment, right? So you have the healthcare industry involved. We're talking about minors. We're talking about sexual identity and gender identity, right? And so in this case, what we're dealing with is whether or not a state is allowed to ban transgender medical procedures for minors, whether that's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And I think because there's so many different pieces at play, we have parental rights, we have the right of the minor, we have the medical treatment piece. And depending on how you frame it, it's looking at, well, this is medically necessary care for some. And for others, they're framing it as, well, this is harming a child in a way that will be irreversible. And they're really too young to have these kinds of procedures done. And I think that depending on what narrative you use will really dictate how you see this case going forward. Additionally, we see the issue of, is this sexual discrimination? Is this discrimination against transgendered individuals, which would lead the court to use a intermediate level of scrutiny? Or is this really discrimination based on age, which does not require the court to use this intermediate level? So the framing of this matter really, I think, is so important in how we discuss this.
Well, I think that's the most important thing that you just said right there, Jennifer, right? And this becomes the dilemma in these conversations, because we're not always talking about the same thing, right? Of how we cast and understand the issue itself means that oftentimes two different people, sometimes who are well-meaning and compassionate and may even agree on a lot, are bitter enemies because that's not what we're really talking about. We're talking about this. I think that there is part of this is the legal issue. Part of this is the political issue. The political issue is the one that is the messier one, and my hope is that the legal side will help clear this out a little bit. But you can see the inconsistencies of, right, the argument of parental rights. I, as a parent, don't want my kids to read these books, and so we're not going to have these books. And yet there's another case in which, so the legislature is saying that it doesn't matter what the parents or the doctors want, you can't do it. Right? That inconsistency tells me we're not really talking about parental rights. What we're talking about is what I think people should be able to do. I think if that was the conversation, we might be able to get somewhere. But the difficulty is it's always politically cloaked, understandably, in a better framing, a more helpful framing, a more positive framing, even if that framing just doesn't seem to fit as much or is inconsistent.
Melissa, as somebody who spends time on Capitol Hill, the idea of trying to separate politics from out of issues that have political, what I would call agendas and victories that you gain, just by fighting the fight, whether you win or not, fighting the fight may be a political victory. How do we start to parse ourselves through the messiness of parents and minors and politics and state politics, which means that a state maybe right next door to Tennessee may see something completely different and people have to start doing forum shopping. I mean, this just seems like this is going to be a never-ending battle.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I really agree with what Andrew said as far as when you look at this from the lens of parental rights, and, if you have a particular sort of political perspective or social ideology, and you're standing up for parental rights in one area, and then in another saying, no, the government needs to take over or usurp the parental rights of those who are coming at this from a different perspective, that's really inconsistent. And I think, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of politically motivated, small p, and partisan motivated legislation on Capitol Hill, both, and we're seeing it even more so in the states, like we're seeing in Tennessee, in the coverage that I was seeing, I think Tennessee is one of 25 states that has similar pieces of legislation that they've passed right now or are thinking of passing. And so I'm very glad that the Supreme Court has taken this case. I will be interested to see, what their ruling is, and whether they deal with the due process clause or the equal protection, or if they kind of punt. It'll be interesting to see. I know that sort of the general consensus is that they will, be taking a conservative approach. That said, I think we all noted that Justice Gorsuch did not participate in the oral arguments, and he's the one that really had the most influence in the court's previous transgender case of Bostock. So, very interesting to see. I don't know that this is going to be the situation where we see the political component separate from the legal, unfortunately.
And it seems to me, Melissa, that this is an issue that the courts are just not equipped to handle. It is, the medical issues alone are so complex. The political issues are so polarizing. I mean, why is this being decided in a court? I mean, that is the way our system is set up, and that's where we find ourselves. But this whole issue of gender dysphoria, the individuals involved in this case, the parents involved in this case, it's incredibly distressing for them. And the way we talk about this case needs to start from their distress. And as we've all noted, that is not the point that most people start this conversation. They start it either at the legal level or the moral level or the medical level. These are individuals, and we have a duty to safeguard the most vulnerable members of our community, which are children, minors. And I think we need to consider that aspect also in this conversation, that these are minors. They're not equipped perhaps at this point to understand the full implications of their decision making. The law already recognises that minors don't have that legal capacity. The ban in Tennessee does not apply to adults. It's only dealing with minors. I think a lot of the acrimony could be sucked out of this whole case if we divided out more clearly how we deal with adults, how we deal with minors. Because it is that duty of care that we owe to our young people that is really, or should be, at the heart of this case.
Jennifer, what I find kind of interesting is the idea that at the lower level, the teenagers got a partial victory, then they go to the Sixth Circuit, it gets reversed. It seems as though we're getting close to a point where the concept of anything involving children should spin off of the idea of what's in the best interest of the child. And because of the complexity of issues, the idea of the best interest of a child right now seems to be getting pushed further and further away as we have cases that are being really pushed based on political agendas and what do the parents want to see happen, maybe even based on their own religious beliefs.
And I agree, and I think that Bettina really, hit on an issue we need to be mindful of, and that is we're dealing with humans, we're dealing with children, and when we frame it in the issue of, not so much the legality or the politics, but here are individuals who are hurting, no matter how you view gender dysphoria or the treatments that are being provided or offered, we're dealing with hurting individuals, and we need to really think about their needs first. And I think Bettina's right. If we were to reframe it with them at the center of how we think of what's best, at least we could take some of the hostility out of the conversation, right? We might not come to the same end point. We might not agree in the end, but at least we can come at it with, we're trying to do what's in the best interest and not trying to use these vulnerable children as political, talking points or to gain political points at the end.
And that, I think, is the central I don't know, dynamic challenge that we have. It is that our posture has tended to be, in the past decade or so, always defensive, right? Which isn't necessarily bad, right? We can defend, but there is a massive difference of not just, well, do we pay attention to ideas, ideology versus people? When we come also with a baseline defensiveness, and I'm defending ideas more, that's my principal thing, to defend ideas. It's not just that we're putting ideas right over people, it's that the people get lost in the wash.
Yeah.
If the defending the idea matters more than anything else, then inevitably dehumanization comes a part of it. Because it doesn't matter that you're a human, in my opinion, made in the image of God, loved by God just as much as me, right? It's that you are a problem. You are an attack, like your existence is, because the idea matters more than the people. I think religiously, politically, culturally, I think that's where we're going on a very dangerous road right now.
I think you're right on point there, Andrew. And the interesting thing of these decisions are not being made by families, talking among themselves. We've got big law firms. We got large advocacy groups. We have major states. We have legislatures, and we have parents, and we have children. And trying to figure out how all that peacefully coexist is going to be the struggle that I have no idea where this will end up. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
All right, Orlin, we were just talking about the great state of Tennessee. Well, one of its most famous daughters, that would be Miss Dolly Parton, has a program called the Imagination Library. It sends free books to children in the state of Tennessee from birth to age 5. And to date, that program has distributed over 200 million free books.
Wow. Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Dorothy, we were just talking about transgender care, and did you know that in the U.S., there are about 300,000 youth, that's ages 13 through 17, who identify as transgender?
Wow. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, Orlin, did you know that there was a German study done in 2018 that found that wearing a necktie can reduce the blood flow to your brain by about 7.5%?
That I did know. Yeah. Andrew, tell me something I don't know.
I mean, first, thank you for that, Bettina. I'm going to use that a lot when people tell me to wear a tie more often. Going back to our first segment, did you know, you may, but it doesn't seem to be a part of the public conversation, that we talk about America's religious landscape. 2/3 of Americans, 67%, self-identify as Christian. 27% self-identify as nothing, and just under 6% of Americans self-identify as any and all other religious traditions on the planet combined.
Appreciate that information. Great conversation today. And thank you again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.